I used this chart before, but I wanted to use it again because it applies to the Chinese religions as well as it does the Japanese religions. This is a list of the world religions by date of founding, starting with Hinduism, which is recognized as the oldest religion, whatever date you put on it, in terms of how far back you go into the Vedic religions, the Vedic culture and the Vedic religious beliefs. You can go back as far as 4000 BC or 2500 BC, or some people would even say it's later than that, because modern Hinduism has developed into its current form over many, many years. Then Judaism, Buddhism, which we have talked about some, and then you will notice Chinese traditional religions. Chinese traditional religions in this regard include Confucianism, that we're going to talk about today, Taoism, that we're going to talk about today, and also the shamanic religions. In other words, the religions that have shamans that are more animistic. Animism is actually the oldest human religion because the belief in spirits of trees and mountains and animals and things of that sort. It was very interesting to me when we were on Miyako Island, and I spoke to our guide and I asked him if the predominant religion there was Shinto or Buddhism or what it was, and he said that the vast majority of people worship their own local gods. He said almost every house in the back will have a shrine to whichever spirit they worship and recognize. Now, so this is a shamanic religion. This is an animistic religion. They will identify the local spirit. When we talked about kami, like in Shinto, there are many different kami, many different spirits. It is related to that. And I said, so this is a kami worship, K-A-M-I. And he said, yes, absolutely. He was surprised, I think, that I knew that word. But there are still, and I'm going to show you a chart, the vast majority of people in China still practice at least partially an animistic, shamanistic religion, where they identify local gods that they worship. So we'll talk about that. I think a lot of people are surprised that that is still so prevalent in the world today, but it really is. Then we get Shinto, which we talked about, is the national religion of Japan, then Jainism, etc., Christianity, Islam, and so forth. I used this before, but I wanted to, again, for those of you who missed it or don't remember it, we'll go over it again. There are three primary families of religions in the world. We are most familiar with the Abrahamic religions, that is the monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Then we have what are called the Dharmic religions. Those are religions that started in India. Dharma is the Hindi word for teaching. The Dharmic religions include Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism. At least Buddhism as it originally began, the Theravada, the school of the fathers or elders Buddhism, the way it was originally taught by the Gautama Buddha. And then the third group are the Taoic religions. And we're going to be talking about those primarily today. It's spelled T-A-O or D-A-O, either way. Again, the words have changed based upon a different way of transliterating in the last 60 years or so. So the Taoic religions of the Far East, especially China and Japan, which include Taoism, Confucianism, and Shinto, along with versions of Buddhism, particularly in China, Shan Buddhism, which is called Zen Buddhism in Japan, and other versions of Mahayana Buddhism, as opposed to the original Theravada Buddhism that was in India. It's very different. To me, it strains credibility a little bit even to call them both the various forms all Buddhism, because they're very different. And then you sometimes can also include various Persian or Iranian religions, such as Zoroastrianism, Mandaeism, the Kurdish Yazdanism, etc. You heard some about these because the Yazidis were one of the tribes that were being heavily persecuted by ISIS because they considered them heretics, not being Islamic. So, but I say sometimes that's included a fourth category because these are all very small now. The populations of these groups are so small, they sometimes don't even get included in big lists, all right? Again, I showed you this, the idea that there was a period of time, which is called the Axial Age, where Buddhism, the Chinese traditional religions, Taoism, Shintoism, particularly as well, or Taoism and Confucianism rather, and then Shinto and Jainism all were developed within 100 years of each other. This is a very critical time in the development of world religions, and nobody knows why. I mean, who pushed the button that meant that we had religions developing in very different parts of the world all at the same time. This is called the Axial Age. They have a name for it because it's such a unique time. So we're going to talk about some of those today, particularly the Chinese traditional religions. This is a painting, a Chinese painting called the Vinegar Tasters. The three characters that are gathered here around the vinegar pot represent Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, because those three traditions have been the primary traditions, teaching traditions in China since very early on. This is an image, a painting, that represents Confucius presenting a young Buddha to Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu is the founder, or Lao Tzu, you may pronounce. Lao Tzu is the pinyin name. The founder of Taoism. Confucius, obviously, or Confuci, if you want to use the Chinese name, was the founder of Confucianism, and this is the idea that the young Buddha, this didn't really happen. Buddha never got to China, okay? He was in India. But this is just a suggestion that these three great religions, the version of Buddhism that they had in China became a Taoic religion, and all of them have some very similar kind of foundational beliefs. They differ in many ways, but they also have some similarities. So this gives you an idea that the three great teaching faiths of China have been Confucianism, Taoism, and the Eastern versions of Buddhism. Now, one of the reasons why you get these three represented is because these faiths do not require strict adherence. In other words, if you are a practicing Jewish person, or a Muslim person, or a Christian person, you're expected to follow certain precepts. And you can't wander off and say, well, I think I'm going to practice, Islamic. I'm a Christian, but I'm going to practice Islamic faith for the next 6 months. That's frowned on. And because there's a sense in which you have committed to, you have faith in, you have adhered to a certain religion. They don't have that same concept. Many of the people in this part of the world will have adherence to various doctrines and various rituals of the different faiths. And so even though for the first several centuries that they were present, following probably the 5th century, 6th century, there was a lot of competition between these three, Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. Eventually, they learned from each other, they adapted ritual from one another, and it's very common for someone to say, well, yes, I'm Buddhist, but I also practice, the disciplines of Confucianism, or I go to Buddhist shrine, or that they're not so concerned about hard lines between them. They practice across the way. But all three of these have had very significant roles in shaping Chinese culture as they've gone along. So, I'm just going to put these up here. I didn't even remember that I had them laid out like that. Taoism, again, it's pronounced Taoism however you spell it. It's pronounced like it's a D, and that's the reason that they changed the spelling on it, because the more modern transliteration, Daoism, is, I've heard people call it Taoism, and that's not how it's pronounced. Then Confucianism, and I'm going to talk about legalism. Legalism does not exist per se today, but it has been very critical in the historical development of China. All of these are almost more what we would consider philosophies than they are religions. Although several of them, not legalism, but Taoism, Confucianism, do recognize spiritual beings, and like Confucianism recognizes that there are deities that you need to respect, but probably you need to avoid. So it's not focused on the worship of any sort of spiritual beings, but they do recognize that there are some. So those three plus Buddhism, and it's primarily the Mahayana Buddhism and Zen, which is called Chan Buddhism in China. It was developed in China as Chan Buddhism. It went over to Korea, where it's known as Xian Buddhism. And then from there, it passed over to Japan, where it is called Zen Buddhism. I just called it Zen here because if I said Chan Buddhism, you probably wouldn't make that connection unless you've really studied this stuff. Then we have the shamanic folk religions. I was talking about the people who worship their own kind of local deity. And then the new religious movements, I'm not going to get into it all because there are a lot of very small, very unique kind of offshoots, versions of Taoism and Confucianism and of Buddhism that have developed, especially in the 20th and early 21st century. They've got new ones popping up all the time. Now, these Eastern religions, as I say, they're for the most part are philosophies. Most of these are non-theistic per se. Buddhism, the Gautama Buddha, when he introduced Buddhism, he said nothing about God or a creator God or worshiping God. That was not part of it at all. That came into it later, a version of it, like in Pure Land Buddhism, where they virtually worship the Amida Buddha, and by having faith in the Amida Buddha and reciting mantras to the Amida Buddha, they feel that they can be eventually taken to the Western paradise with Amida. So they picked up some of those kinds of more Western themes, but all of these, Confucianism, Taoism, certainly legalism, which is really a political system, it's kind of a Machiavellian political system, and even Buddhism, for the most part, are not theistic religions. The focus is not on a creator God and worshiping that creator God so much as it is figuring out how you're supposed to live your life. Okay? Although there are spiritual aspects to it. The lines get very fuzzy between philosophy and religion when you start talking about Eastern religions. And so down here at the bottom, I've got, if you can see that, these Far Eastern religions may be polytheistic, many gods, monotheistic, belief in one God. They may be henotheistic, a word you may not know. Henotheistic means you believe there are many gods, but you pick only one that you're going to worship. Pantheistic, meaning everything that exists together makes up God. Panentheistic means that everything is part of God, but then God is something more than that. Like in Native American religions, when they talk about the Great Spirit, they have the spirit of the wolf and the spirit of the river and the spirit of the mountain, but then the Great Spirit is even more than that. That's panentheism. Non-theistic, meaning not believing in God per se, and then agnostic, I don't know, or I can't know, all right? It can be any combination of those things in a very strange way. This is a chart which shows the various spread of religions around China. This represents mainland China. The red area that you see here are the Chinese traditional religions, particularly having to do with worship of ancestors, with worship of local kami. I'm using a Japanese word there rather than a Chinese word because I've spent a lot of time talking about kami and you understand that. And some combination of those things along with Taoism and Confucianism. So that is a huge part, especially in the central and south central part. And then you'll see these stripes. That means that exists all over to some extent. The yellow area here, which you will notice is predominantly, you know what that is? Somebody tell me. That's Tibet. So there and then up through this area, that is Buddhist. Tibetan Buddhism, which is a version of Vajrayana Buddhism, obviously is the religion of Tibet and other areas. The green area here that you see, which you'll notice is primarily on the western side, is Muslim. It is primarily the Hui Muslims, which is a group of Chinese that are entirely Muslim, or the Uyghurs, which is a development from the northern Mongol peoples, and they too converted to Islam, and they exist in other places. You'll see a little bit of green up here, but it's predominantly in the west. The pink areas are ethnic minority traditional religions, small ones. The aqua is Tanjernam, which is the Mongolian shamanism, and that's why you see that in the north, the aqua here. Then we have the light green as the Northeast China folk religions, like Manchu religions, etc. So wide variety, but pretty much all over the country you'll have some admixture of Chinese folk religion, Confucianism, and Taoism. They are the primary ones. Buddhism was very significant until toward the end of the Tang Dynasty that we talked about today, and because the Buddhist monks began to take too much on themselves, they started trying to influence the government, they started trying to push their way around, as they did in Japan as well, and Buddhist monks in that time were not unknown to take up arms, to try to forcefully get what they thought should happen to occur. And so the Tang Dynasty ended up suppressing Buddhism, just like the Meiji Restoration tried to suppress Buddhism and eventually tried to get rid of it. But it still hangs around, but it's not nearly as predominant as it used to be. There are a number of different gods that are worshipped in various cults along the way. For instance, I was very surprised and interested that when we were in Singapore at the end of the last cruises we did, right in the middle of Singapore, near the Chinatown area, they have a temple to Mazu, which is the sea goddess. It's a beautiful, extraordinary temple. But you will have temples to Mazu, to Huangdi, who is sort of the patriarchal divinity of China. You'll have Guandi, who is the god of both war and business, which I find very interesting. War and business. And then Kai Shen, who is the god of prosperity and wealth. So you will get particular kind of cult worships and find temples of various kinds to particular gods as you go around. Common themes in the Taoic religions, and all of these in China are one form of Taoic religion or another. First and foremost is the principle of the Tao itself. Tao literally means the way or the path or the route. It is the flow of the universe. It is the natural order of things moving forward. It's like the life force that is the universe. One of the very important symbols in Taoism is the yin and yang. You know that symbol, right? The circle that is broken up into black and white curved sections, because it's seen that everything in the Tao is in balance. The flow is in balance. And so this natural order of things, people talk about, yeah, I got in the groove, I got in the flow. Well, that's kind of a reference to what Taoism is meaning when they say that there is a Tao, a flow, a natural order of things in the universe. And the task of Taoism is to get into that flow and to participate with that rather than fight against it all the time, which they feel that most people do. Part of that is the concept of the Qi, whether it's spelled Qi or Chi. These are both Chinese references. This is the old one. You can usually tell the old Wade Giles way of writing words because it used a lot of apostrophes. And then the Qi, because Q is pronounced CH. Or in Japanese, because they have the same concept, the Ki. It's the active principle that forms part of any living thing, the breath, the air, the life force, the energy flow. If you've ever participated in martial arts, they talk about the Qi, that letting it flow through them. In order to be able to be effective in martial arts. So one way to think about this is like the Tao is all the electricity that's flowing in the world, and the Qi is the place that you can plug in and access it. So the Qi is your particular ability to access the larger flow of the natural order of the universe. Does that make sense? And then the Dai or Te, it's actually pronounced day either way. This is moral character, integrity, virtue, morality, quality, merit, virtuous deeds. At least in Taoism, you're not supposed to have to work at this. But if you really are in the flow of things, if you really are, fitting in with the flow of the universe and accessing Qi appropriately, then your life will reflect these things. Moral character, integrity, virtue. This is what, Dai is what the Tao looks like when it's working in a person's life. But not that you have to grit your teeth and work hard to try to be moral and have quality and merit. It should be something that happens naturally. Particularly in Taoism, an effort to achieve these things is directly contrary to the idea of getting into the flow of the Tao as you go along. If some of this sounds strange to you, it's because to Western ears, this is strange. This is not the sort of thing we're used to, but it is fundamental to understanding the sort of ethos and psyche of the Eastern religions. So Taoism, the first of these. This is an image of Lao Tzu, or as he used to be called, Lao Tzu. Some people still use that name. And again, lots of hyphens and lots of apostrophes in the old way of writing these things. They've got rid of a lot of that. Taoism is by most people who practice it, is not called a religion. They don't recognize it as a religion. They think of it as a way of life. They think of it as the natural way of things, rather than a religion that you adhere to because you've made a profession of faith, or you signed the church register, or you went forward on a Sunday night and declared, that you believed, or whatever it was. It is just simply, that's the way of the natural world, and Taoism is an effort to try to be in tune with that. It emphasizes unity in the universe and of the material world, of the spiritual world, a unity of all things. Everything is connected. The past, present, future, it focuses on doctrines of relativism, spontaneity, and emptiness. That's what I meant by you don't grit your teeth and really work hard to try to be moral. Rather, you release yourself and allow that to flow through you, the Tao to flow through you, so that you can achieve the objectives of having a life that is consistent with the flow of the Tao. So they talk about emptiness. Don't force your personality thinking that's what's going to work, or to be spontaneous. Taoists, a serious Taoist, has a lot of trouble with Confucianism, because Confucianism, as we'll talk about, is very much about recognizing your place in the world, your responsibility because of that place in the world, and then doing that. That's not what Tao is all about to the Taoists. The doctrines of Taoism, I'm just going to pop all these up here. This is from an old presentation I did, I guess. The Tao and the Day is the flow of the universe, the active expression of the Tao resulting from an individual living and cultivating the Tao, the flow in your life. The Wu Wei is one of the doctrines, which means non-action. Wei means to act, Wu means not. And that effortless action, or action without intent, it's to respond naturally and without effort to the flow in the universe. So if you're working at it, you're doing it wrong. It should be a thing in which you relax into it and you allow yourself to be in tune. Naturalness, or Ziran, is the central value describing the primordial state of all things, associated with spontaneity and creativity. Again, to spontaneously react, to not to have to plan out, this is exactly the opposite of New Year's resolutions, for instance. Okay, I am going to set a plan for myself, I'm going to lose weight, that's directly the opposite of what Taoism is about. You're supposed to allow yourself to be in the flow rather than try to force it because you've made decisions about things. And then, as I mentioned, the yin and the yang, the opposite, contrary and complementary forces that exist in the world. And this comes into play in all kinds of ways. For instance, I talked about Japanese gardens, and they have a concept of the yin and yang as well, the balance. Rocks and water are seen as yin and yang. They complement one another. And so that's, in designing a Japanese garden, they will be very intentional about designing them so that they have a balance between those things. And the water may be represented by gravel or sand, but still there's the idea that there needs to be a harmony, a balance between that. The north represents water, the south represents earth. And so the flow of water should be from the north to the south, or from the east to the west. In very particular ways. Some of this gets into Feng Shui, if you're familiar with that. The idea that designing a living space affects how you experience it in your everyday life. I'm not pitching that. I'm very neutral in this. I always have to keep saying, remember, I'm a Presbyterian minister. But there is a lot of truth that we can learn from these things. How far you take it is entirely up to you. So, terms and texts in Taoism. One thing that a lot of people may be familiar with, even if they don't know much about Taoism, is the I Ching. This is pronounced I Ching. And you see the symbol up in the left with the yin and yang in the middle, and the various symbols around it, those are called hexagrams. The I Ching is a divination, a way to prophesy or to discover truths. The I Ching is a book that represents 64 different interpretive hexagrams that are combinations of 8 basic symbols. And they literally will use it in divination they'll have a series of wands, each of which has a hexagram on it. and they will cast those 8 wands or 8 stones, and whatever order they come up in, you look up in the I Ching and it will tell you what that means. Now, some people use it still as a method of divination, of figuring out some truth by this process. Many people, most people probably, use the I Ching as a meditation tool, because each of the descriptions within the I Ching tells you truths about life that are consistent with the Tao. And so people will use it to meditate, they will use it to discover more about how they are supposed to live within the principle of Taoism and the Tao. The Tao Te Ching is a book, a text for teaching Taoism. Both of these books are purported to have been written by Lao Tzu himself, the founder of Taoism. Carol and I were having a discussion at lunch. Some scholars will say, well, Lao Tzu never existed. Well, that's kind of irrelevant, because somebody wrote these books, whether the name was Lao Tzu or Bill. Somebody, had these concepts and put them down a very long time ago. So sometimes they get into arguments about things like whether Lao Tzu really lived. Well, somebody with this concept did. You then get into the Zhuangzi, the ancient Chinese text. It's from the late 3rd century, which is a further telling of stories and anecdotes in order to help people understand the carefree nature, the relaxed kind of going with the flow that is part of Taoist, of the ideal Taoist sage. And then the Dao Zhang is the Taoist collection. It's all of the other writings, all of the writings, including the I Ching and the Tao Te Ching, that are put together, that are the texts that are used in studying, in learning of, and in meditating in Taoism. So, and that's being added to all the time. They are constantly, Taoist masters are still writing interpretations, both from the I Ching and interpretations of life consistent with the Taoist. And so there are additions being made to the Dao Zhang all the time. So let's go now to the next of the major 3 teaching religions in China, which is Confucianism. It is sometimes called Ruism, because Ru is the Chinese word for scholar, and this is seen as a very scholarly study. Confucianism, the founder Confucius, or Kung Fu Zhe, if you're using his Chinese name, he started out as being a scholar and thinker, and Confucius traveled around China in his lifetime trying to convince local rulers or local politicians to hire him in order to make their rule, their kingdom, more orderly and more appropriate. The principle behind Confucianism, it is a system whereby individually and as a society, we should be able to live a more fulfilling, satisfying, orderly, and peaceful existence. So again, probably even more than Taoism, it's much more a social philosophy than it is, or at least in its founding, than it is a religion. Although there have been, Confucianism says there are spirits, they need to be, Confucianism is interesting, it said there are spirits and you better respect them, but as much as possible stay away from them, avoid them. So a complex system of moral, social, political, and religious thought. And you will remember I said that Confucianism was very valuable in terms of the kamikazes, in terms of the samurai warriors. Even though Confucianism was primarily Japanese, it affected Buddhism and Shinto when all of this came over to, Shinto started in Japan, but when the other religions came over to Japan. And part of the idea behind Confucianism is you have a role, you have an obligation to fulfill that role in a responsible way. And included in that are absolute loyalty to family and to whoever your master is. And that that's the greatest responsibility that you have, is to fulfill your obligations for the role that you've been given in life above anything else. And so you realize that Confucianism, by affecting Shinto, by affecting the Buddhism that carried over into Japan, that became kind of the justification for people willing to kill themselves in order to be able to fulfill what they thought was their responsibility, their social place in the order of things. So familial duty, loyalty, and humaneness is a big part of that. There are 5 major books that are considered the classics, the Wu Jing of Confucianism. That is the I Ching, the same book that is used by Taoism, the Classic of Poetry, the Book of Documents, the Book of Rites, and the Spring and Autumn Annals. You will remember when I talked about the history, there was a spring and autumn period of revolution or pre-revolution that happened in China. Well, it's called the spring and autumn period because the spring and autumn annals are a historical record of that period. And it's more than just a historical record, because history as we understand it isn't what they were writing. It's sort of an analysis of that in terms of what we are to learn about our responsibility and about society by those things. A major concept for Confucianism is Tian, or heaven, the divine. It's similar to what Taoists would call the Tao. It means the heavenly or divine order of things. And so the goal within Confucianism is to unite yourself with the Tian. It's very similar to allowing yourself to be consistent with the Tao. And in fact, these have influenced each other greatly as they went along. Within Confucianism, there are 5 constants: humaneness, justice, proper ritual, you need to perform certain rituals, knowledge, and integrity. And their virtues are loyalty, first and foremost. Loyalty is the virtue. Filial piety, reliability, and righteousness. So a very strong, and again, Confucius, his focus, he wanted somebody to hire him to make their society, their culture, their kingdom, whatever the political unit was, to turn that into a much more peaceful, systematically ordered, and organized way for people to live. And that's very much what Confucianism is all about. Chinese legalism does not, in any pure sense, exist anymore, but it has been very critical in the development of Chinese culture. The first emperor of the Chinese dynasty, the Qin dynasty, who was Qin, remember what his name was? Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor, the terracotta soldier emperor. He used legalism to really create the first imperial dynasty within China. This fellow here is Shang Dang, and he is the one that really developed, articulated the legalist idea that was later used by a number of different dynasties within the history of China. The idea here, the focus is on how you can efficiently and effectively govern. It is not concerned with morality other than fairness, but it's not people focused, it's focused from the point of view of the authorities. How do they set up and maintain an orderly society and government? It is, as I mentioned briefly earlier, very Machiavellian. How do you rule well? And the primary focus here is that you have clear rules that are evenly and fairly administered, and people understand what the rules are, and if they violate those rules, the penalty for that is not only unavoidable, but it is very severe. And so the first emperor, Shi Huangdi, implemented legalism, and for that reason he's known as having been very heavy-handed. Again, the story is that he burned books and buried scholars who he didn't like what they had to say. They now believe that's probably not true, but it is true that his legalistic system was very tight-fisted. It was very strong. In fact, so strong that this fellow, Shang, ended up, a law that he had instituted, he violated it and was torn apart by chariots. 2 other major legalist scholars, Han Fei and Li Shi, similarly ended up falling afoul of the laws that they helped create, and both ended up dying for it. So it's kind of a harsh reality approach to government, but legalism provided the structure. And you'll remember under the history lecture, I talked about the fact that China has gone through almost a roller coaster. They will have a period of very stable government and be prosperous economically and culturally, and then they'll go through a period of rebellion and of warring factions and terrible time, and then they will come back to somebody taking charge and instituting an order that they have a prosperous time again. And they go through this series. Quite frequently, when they've had a very bad time with a lot of warring and a lot of killing and all of that, with multiple different kingdoms being established, The emperor who came along and settled all that, not uncommonly used legalism to do it, because it does not allow for people to take latitude in terms of being obedient to the government. And so Chinese legalism was an important part of that. The picture over here, one of the ways that legalism was maintained is through a very structured system where he had, he being Shi Huangdi and then later other emperors, would have local magistrates who are responsible for being aware of the law and the penalties for the law and then monitoring the society. So they ended up being sort of legal authorities and judges that he placed around the country to make sure that people followed the legalistic rules that he had. And the last one I'm not going to talk about a lot because I've spoken a lot about Buddhism already, but the Buddhism that came into China came via the Silk Road. I talked about the Silk Road during the history. I'm going to do a talk just about the Silk Road. While we think about silk and horses and ceramics and spices and all these other things that traveled on the Silk Road, the most important things that traveled on the Silk Road were not material things, but rather conceptual things. Philosophies, religions, Buddhism particularly, traveled from India into the East, into China, was accepted there and became uniquely Chinese, especially through the Chan, or Japanese word Zen Buddhism. It's also true that Christianity, in the Asia Minor, the church under Constantine a little later, they declared that there was a particular kind of religious belief called Nestorianism. It had to do with the nature of Christ as being both human and divine, and they declared that Nestorians were heretics, that their interpretation of the nature of Christ was not consistent with Scripture or with what the doctrine was. Well, the Nestorians, in large numbers, ended up responding to that by moving east. And so Nestorian Christians, almost all of the Christians that you read about or bump into in terms of the history of these areas, China, the Mongolians had scholars who were Nestorian Christians that worked for them. They are all part of that Nestorian, and they traveled along the routes that were the Silk Road, just like the Buddhist messages did. So Buddhism came into China via the Silk Road. As I told you, the original Theravada Buddhism was very consistent with the Indian understanding of life and how to deal with life, because it was particularly focused on suffering, death, rebirth, suffering in life, death, rebirth, the samsara, the cycle. This was very consistent with Hinduism. And the whole focus of the things that Buddha said was, how do you deal with the suffering? How do you get out of the cycle of suffering? The ultimate goal being that you achieve nirvana, which means nothingness, that you don't have to be reborn. As I quoted my old friend saying after he heard me speak on this, he said, so if I were a Hindu or a Theravada Buddhist, if I live my life really badly, my karma will be bad, and I will come back as a lesser person, lower in class or with disabilities or with something else. And if I'm really, really bad, I come back as a toad. But if I'm really, really good, I don't have to come back at all. And while that sounds a little flip, that's pretty accurate. That concept, as being the whole purpose of Buddhism as a religion, didn't fit with the beliefs outside India. And so when Buddhism traveled via the Silk Road into other areas, first, it went further out to Persia, it affected Persia, it came over to China. They ended up taking the concepts of Buddhism and radically changing it to the point of it being a focus on meditation, without any focus on samsara, this rebirth and reincarnation. Or it became like the Amida Pure Land Buddhism, where the idea is if you have faith in the right Buddha, you will end up with an eternal paradise. Completely different than what the original Gautama Buddha said. And so within China, the development of Buddhism radically changed what Buddhism was all about, primarily through Chan or Zen Buddhism, through Pure Land Buddhism, etc. And then those things also then carried over into Korea and Japan. Don't laugh. Any questions about any of that? Yes?
Why are there so many new religions now coming up in China?
Why are there so many new religions now coming up? Well, there's always been an inclination for people to, to find a better way to do things. Quite often, a new religion will be because of a syncretism. They will take elements of one thing they like, and then elements of another thing they like, and they will combine them together. And you've ended up in the history of both China and Japan having very significant problems when that happened. In Japan, for instance, there was a major rebellion at one point because it was a Christian group that developed some heretical ideas. The leader of that group claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus, and he got a big enough following that they tried to take over the government, and it became a major rebellion. And so these things happen. I think why they're happening more now, I think it may be that there is, in modern times, there is greater dissatisfaction with their lives. We have higher expectations because we have been so blessed, we have so much, and yet we don't find fulfillment in them. And so we're always looking for a new thing. There was Pfeiffer's People, the cartoon strip? The movie Carnal Knowledge was based upon some of his work. I remember a cartoon strip once, and it was just a guy's head, and he said, I used to be such a loser. I failed at school, I couldn't keep a job, I was terrible with girls, and then I found the true religion. Suddenly I was an excellent student, I'm doing terrifically at work, everybody thinks I'm great, but someday I will find a truer religion that will make me better with girls. Right? You laugh, that the truth behind that is that's why a lot of the new religions start. It's because there's something they're still looking for. They haven't found it yet. And I'm speaking from my own, my theological training there, but other than that, I really couldn't say. There may be other factors. Yes?
The percentage of religions in surveys in China is what we say they are.
It's about 30 to 34% identify themselves as some version of Buddhist. Again, a large percentage would identify themselves as being shamanistic religions, folk religions. In fact, so much so that that's why on the chart that I have, I don't say Taoist, Confucianist, I say Chinese traditional religions, because again, it's difficult for them to survey those things because most Chinese, like most Japanese, do not see their particular religions as being religions. They're not something that you sign a card and say, I'm now a member. It rather is a way of life for them. And so when you ask them what religion do you belong to, they go, well, I don't know, even though they may have a shrine in their house. So in terms of people that would adhere to specific faiths, Buddhism is probably the one that would get the highest number in the 30s. You have 2 to 4% Christian in China right now, and you've got 1 to 2% Islamic. There actually are 5 religions that the People's Republic of China identify as legal. Those are Taoism, Islam, Buddhism, Protestantism, and Catholicism. But interestingly enough, they don't allow the Chinese Catholic Church to be affiliated with the Roman Catholic Church. They have to be independent, and they're allowed. Interestingly enough, even though Confucianism has been such an important part of the history of China and has driven so much of their kind of thinking and culture, Confucianism currently is not accepted as a legal religion in communist China. And there have been movements, there continue to be movements, to try to get Confucianism accepted as a legal religion, and then the hope is that they'll begin to start reinstituting Confucius beliefs into some of the culture, even the schools. So we'll see what happens with that. Yes? Okay, you need to speak up. I can't hear you.
I'm really confused that it seems that, at least in the West here, we think of religion as worshiping a single God. And then there's any gods over in the East that they worship, whether it's one or more, maybe Confucian or spirits, but so I'm trying to figure out why we call them a religion to begin with, instead of philosophy.
Well, it is completely different than what we're used to. I think that's the real point of what you're saying. And so it's very difficult for us to get our heads around it because we think of a monotheistic religion. I mean, we are all, with rare exceptions perhaps, unless we have decided we want to adhere to like Buddhist faith or something else, We are all from the Abrahamic religion school. We are all either Christian, whether we practice this, we come from a culture that is either Jewish or Christian or perhaps Islamic. And yet you need to understand that they have a very different concept of what it means to be divine. When they said that the emperor, Hirohito, for instance, was divine, he was a god, they didn't mean a god like the Jewish and Christian Father in heaven. They meant he was a divine spirit, and there can be many of those. They identify, as I mentioned, the Mazu, the goddess of the sea, that was a temple in Singapore. Beautiful temple. I mean, one of the most ornate temples I've ever seen. And I was surprised to see it sitting there because the Mazu is primarily a Taoist deity. And yet, you do see that. You see various kinds of temples. You're going to see some Buddhist shrines to Buddhist deities. Again, the original Buddha, Gautama Buddha, did not purport to believe in any deities. It was entirely about human life and how you can recognize what is causing your suffering, how you can alleviate that suffering and no longer have to be in the cycle by which you have to keep repeating suffering in each life that you have. There was no God talk in there. But now Buddhism, particularly Buddhism in the East, has very distinct deities. But it's difficult for us to understand that deity doesn't mean God the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. It doesn't mean Allah. It doesn't mean Jehovah or Yahweh. It is rather one of many spiritual beings. One way you might think about it, if you have any sense of the Catholic Church, is that those spirits are much more like Catholic saints. Meaning, you believe that they hear you, you believe they can help you, you believe that they are in some way in the presence of the great high God, that they are still there and can be of assistance to you, and they are more than just human, but they're not God. Does that make sense? So that's very much the kind of spiritual approaches taken by Eastern religions. And it's very hard for us to wrap our head around that. First here on the right, yes, go ahead.
So do they generally believe in reincarnation, if that, rather than heaven and hell like Christian religions?
Well, it depends. Again, the original Buddhism had no sense of heaven and hell. There was no sense of there was no sense of an afterlife. You always came back, and if you didn't come back, if you were good enough, that you achieved the level nirvana, meant you didn't have to come back at all. In other words, you no longer existed. You sort of melted into the universe. Yeah. Now, that's not true with a lot of the newer versions of the religions, particularly even the Buddhist religions in China and Japan, like as I used the example, which is the most westernized of the Buddhist faiths, which is Pure Land or Amida Buddhism. It's called the Western Paradise Buddhism, where if you pronounce a phrase, Namu Amida Butsu, and there's even a difference because there's one sect of the Amida Pure Land Buddhism that says you only have to say that once in faith and that's enough, and some of them say the more you repeat it, the better off you are. But the idea is that this Buddha, this enlightened being, Amida, will, if you have faith in Amida's ability to save you, will eventually, when you die, will take you to the Western paradise, will take you to heaven. They don't use that word, but that's basically what it sounds like. And so that's completely different than Theravada Buddhism, where it all started. So there's all sorts of different mixtures. Some believe in an afterlife, some do not. A lot of the worshippers of Kami, like we talked about in Shinto, they believe that you're not going to go to heaven, but that you can come back as, rather than being a spirit that is subjected to Yomi, the place of darkness, you can come back as a guardian spirit. You can have, an existence which is very satisfying after that. Not that you're going to go to heaven, you'll still be floating around here, but that you'll find satisfaction in that. So there's a wide range. Okay, Philippe?
Do you know the percentage of atheists in China?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Atheists.
Atheist. Okay, atheist. I had to put my French interpretation hat on. Atheists. There are a lot of atheists, particularly in mainland China today, because those who are truly committed to the Communist Party would say, no, we don't believe that. Because Chinese communism is based upon Leninist communism. And as we well know, Marx said religion is the opiate of the people, and the desire of Marxist-Leninist communism was to try to get rid of religion because they believed it was a bad influence. Those who are truly communist in China would probably say the same thing. China allows 5 legal religions because they at least are smart enough to realize that you don't just stop. Albania, for instance, when it was a very close country, they announced they were the first purely atheistic country in history. And then when Enver Hoxha died, it took them about 5 minutes to start worshiping again. Right? Because human beings, there is an inherent desire of whatever flavor to have some sort of acknowledgement. There's never been a society ever known anywhere, no culture ever, that didn't have some sort of belief in the afterlife or the divine or spirits or something else. There is something inherent in human beings that look for that. They always say there's no atheists in the foxholes. At a certain point, people start looking for it. Okay? First here and then in the back. Yes? Go ahead. Yeah.
So China has been building Confucian institutes or centers around the world, particularly in Africa. So what you're saying about Confucianism not being a religion, does that mean that they're just purely Chinese cultural centers?
I would say, yes. So they're building centers in other parts of the world, like Africa. It's an effort to try to build a relationship with the various countries around the world, and they are cultural centers, but they would not reflect any religious beliefs. Confucianism, as I say, is not even considered legal as a practice in mainland China now, so they certainly would not be Confucians. They by reflecting the history of Chinese culture, if they do, then they sort of through the back door will be including some of the Confucianism and Taoism, etc. But they wouldn't say that up front, that that's what they're doing, okay? In the back? Is there a concept of good and evil? Yes. I mean, there's a concept of morality. The idea, as I said in Taoism, is that if you really are in tune with the Tao, if you've sort of gotten into the flow and you are living consistent, and the best example of this is from Star Wars, the Force, right? May the Force be with you. Don't try so hard. Just allow yourself to experience the Force, and you can do extraordinary things. That's a pop culture version to what the Tao is in the Taoic religions. So they would say that if you allow that to happen, then you will manifest morality and goodness and integrity and those things. But not because you worked at it, quite the contrary, because you just allowed yourself to be in sync with what the Tao is saying. Now, I present all this as a neutral party. I'm not trying to sell you guys on Far Eastern religions, okay? Because again, my own beliefs, I think everybody has to decide where they're going to plant their flag. I am a Christian and a Christian minister. But I think that I have a responsibility to understand what other beliefs are and what other people believe, and in as much detail as I can, in order to be both respectful to them and also to have a clear sense of why it is I believe what I believe. So, I try to be a very neutral party in this, but I don't want people to go away saying, man, he believes everything. He's one of those guys. Did you have another question?
If you're going against the flow, would that be considered to be evil or just
Well, just completely non-productive. If you're going against the flow, if you're not in the Tao, then that's the frustration. You've had one of those days where, you pull your sock on and there's a hole in it, you start to brush your teeth and your toothbrush breaks and like everything is going wrong. That's an example of you are not in the Tao. You are not going with the flow, because if you are, things will go well for you. Okay, right over here.
In the Abrahamic religions, there's a clear code and
Correct.
morality. I don't get the sense that they have, like, thou shalt not kill.
Right,
It's
correct.
just like, be good.
Right. Yeah, Judaism, as the first monotheistic religion, is actually, in all of the 3 monotheistic religions, are called, technically, ethical monotheism. Because Judaism is the first religion that ever came along that said, first you have to believe in Yahweh, God, but then once you do, you only prove that if you act a certain way. The 10 Commandments being the epitome of that. And the same thing is true in Christianity, the same thing is true in Islam. They have very clear moral expectations. You are supposed to act in a certain way. There are not those kind of ethical admonitions in the Eastern religions. The idea is if you're doing it right, you should be a better person. You should be more moral, but they don't tell you, do this, don't do that. So ethical monotheism is fairly unique in that regard because it does give you, as part of the faith, here's how you should act. Okay?